Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Flight That Changed Everything. Jake Sullivan, a 28-year-old flight attendant with a reputation for his calm demeanor and precise efficiency, moved briskly through the aisle of Flight 417. The Boeing 737 hummed softly beneath him as the last of the passengers stowed their bags and settled into their seats for the 4-hour flight from Chicago to Las Vegas. Jake's polished shoes reflected the cabin's soft overhead lights as he flashed his signature warm smile to anyone who caught his eye. Jake had seen it all in his 8 years as a flight attendant: excited honeymooners, rowdy spring breakers, nervous first-time flyers, and the stoic businessmen glued to their laptops. Each flight brought its own energy, its own story. Today, however, there was a strange unease in the air, though he couldn't yet put his finger on why. The unsettling pair. As Jake moved toward the rear of the cabin to assist with some luggage, he glanced over the rows of passengers. In row 14A, a young girl caught his attention. She looked small, fragile even, no older than 16. Her long black hair fell messily around her shoulders, and her almond-shaped eyes darted around the cabin, her expression anxious. She looked like any other nervous teenager, except something about her seemed off. Her body was rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Beside her, in seat 14B, sat a man in his 40s. He was sharply dressed, wearing an expensive silver watch that glinted under the cabin lights. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm. While most passengers around him flipped through magazines or scrolled through their phones, the man just sat there, his hand resting firmly on the girl's forearm. The gesture appeared casual to anyone who wasn't paying close attention, but Jake noticed the way her shoulders tensed under his touch. Jake had seen men like this before, men who carried an air of quiet authority, who blended into crowds because they knew how to disappear in plain sight. Still, there were no outward signs of a problem. Jake reminded himself that he was reading too much into it. After all, people flew with family members all the time. But as he returned to the front of the plane, he couldn't shake the uneasy knot forming in his stomach. A watchful eye. Across the aisle, in 14D, Sarah Thompson watched the pair with equal concern. A high school teacher from Milwaukee on her way to a much-deserved solo vacation, Sarah had spent over a decade working with teenagers. She could read their behavior better than most people. Something about the girl didn't sit right with her. Sarah had noticed it from the moment they boarded. The girl had stayed quiet, keeping her head down as the man guided her to her seat. When they sat, she hadn't spoken a word. The man, on the other hand, had exchanged pleasantries with a neighbor in the row ahead, introducing himself as Marcus and claiming to be traveling with his niece. But Sarah could see it in the girl's body language, the way she avoided eye contact, how she flinched at the man's touch, and the barely noticeable tremor in her hands. This wasn't a carefree trip for a family reunion. Something was wrong. Sarah picked up a paperback and pretended to read, though her attention remained fixed on the pair. She watched as Marcus ordered water for himself and soda for the girl, his voice calm but clipped, his gaze watchful. He's controlling her, Sarah thought. The signal. An hour into the flight, Jake wheeled the beverage cart down the aisle. Passengers greeted him with polite smiles as he handed out drinks and snacks, but his mind kept drifting back to the girl in 14A. When he reached their row, he forced himself to smile. "Can I get you anything to drink?" he asked Marcus. The man looked up, his expression neutral but cool. "Just water for me, a soda for her." Jake nodded and grabbed the drinks. As he turned to hand the soda to the girl, he glanced at her face. She was staring straight ahead, her eyes wide, unblinking. But when her hand reached up to take the cup, something unexpected happened. It was quick, so quick that most people wouldn't have seen it. Her hand trembled slightly as she took the drink, and her fingers curled inward, thumb tucked into her palm, fingers wrapped over it. The knot in Jake's stomach tightened. His heart skipped a beat. It was a signal. a silent signal Jake recognized from a training seminar on human trafficking. It was an internationally recognized hand gesture, a cry for help, subtle enough that an abuser might not notice but clear to anyone who knew what to look for. The flight attendant's face remained neutral as he handed over the drink, but his mind was racing. What do I do now? He knew the procedure. Flight attendants were trained to identify and handle these situations carefully. He couldn't confront Marcus outright, not here midair, with no way for anyone to escape. He needed to involve the authorities discreetly. As Jake moved to the galley at the back of the plane, he caught the eye of his colleague, Maria, who was busy preparing snack trays. He leaned close and whispered, "Maria, I need you to cover for me for a minute. There's something I have to check on." Her eyes narrowed. "What's wrong?" "Can't explain yet. Just trust me." A silent plan. Jake slipped into the cramped rear lavatory and pulled out his phone. Although cell phone use was prohibited mid-flight, the airplane's onboard system allowed crew members to communicate with the cockpit and, if necessary, send emergency messages to ground authorities. His hands trembled slightly as he typed a coded message to the pilot, describing the situation: suspected trafficking. Row 14A, young girl made hand signal for help. Male companion controlling behavior. Request permission to contact ground authorities. The response came quickly. Permission granted. Air traffic control notified. Law enforcement will meet us upon landing. Use caution. Jake exhaled sharply. Relief mixed with tension. The authorities would be waiting in Las Vegas, but they still had over 2 hours of flight time left. Anything could happen in that time, and Jake knew he needed to keep the situation from escalating. As he exited the lavatory, he passed row 14 again. The girl didn't look up, but her hands fidgeted nervously in her lap. Jake caught the briefest glance of her eyes. "Hold on, kid," he thought. "We've got you." Sarah's instincts. Sarah had seen Jake's subtle movements as he passed by, and her teacher's instincts told her something was happening. When Jake had approached the galley, his usually calm demeanor had seemed strained, and when he exited the bathroom moments later, his gaze lingered just a bit too long on the girl in 14A. He knows something too, Sarah realized. That solidified it. She wasn't imagining things. Sarah waited for a moment when Marcus was distracted, then pretended to drop her book onto the floor. As she bent down to retrieve it, she looked directly at the girl and whispered softly, "If you're in trouble, nod once." The girl's expression froze. For a second, Sarah thought she wouldn't respond. But then, as she straightened back up, the girl gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. She needs help. The clock ticks. In the galley, Jake quickly briefed Maria on the situation. "We're handling this quietly. Authorities will be waiting when we land." Maria nodded, her expression serious. "What do we do until then?" "Keep an eye on them. Make sure they don't suspect anything." Jake glanced down the aisle. Marcus appeared calm, oblivious to the invisible storm brewing around him, but the girl's hand still trembled faintly. The next 2 hours would test Jake's patience, Sarah's courage, and Lily's fragile hope, but none of them knew yet just how dangerous the situation would become. Shadows of the past. The hum of the engine seemed louder than usual as Flight 417 cruised at 35,000 feet. The passengers settled into their routines, napping, watching in-flight movies, and chatting quietly. But in row 14, the air was heavier, thick with tension that only a few could sense. In seat 14A, Lavi Chen's fingers twisted nervously in her lap as she stared at the seat back in front of her. She tried to keep her breathing steady, to appear calm, but every nerve in her body screamed at her to escape. She knew she had taken a monumental risk by signaling for help, but now there was no turning back. Next to her, Marcus Delgado's grip on the armrest tightened subtly. His dark sunglasses obscured his eyes, but his body language betrayed an edge that wasn't there before. He could feel something shifting, like the room had changed temperature without anyone noticing. Everything's fine, Marcus said quietly, his voice calm but sharp. Lily flinched at the sound. You haven't done anything stupid, have you? No, Lily murmured, her voice barely audible. Marcus leaned closer, his mouth a thin line. Because you know what happens if you do. Lily bit the inside of her cheek, fighting back the tears welling in her eyes. Jake's hidden strategy. At the back of the plane, Jake Sullivan returned to the galley, where Maria had finished restocking the beverage cart. They're still calm, she whispered. But that guy's watching you like a hawk. Jake nodded, his mind racing. We can't let him catch on. If he senses we know something, he could do anything to keep control. Maria frowned. What do you want me to do? Run interference. Keep an eye on Marcus while I monitor Lily. Maria hesitated for a moment before nodding firmly. Got it. And if anything happens, we act. Jake stepped out of the galley, his demeanor calm and professional as he resumed walking down the aisle. He couldn't afford to show any signs of tension. On the surface, it had to look like business as usual. As he reached row 14, Jake's eyes briefly flicked to Lily. She looked up, just for a second, and in her dark eyes, he saw a flicker of something that nearly stopped him in his tracks. Hope. We're going to get you out of this, Jake thought. The teacher's resolve. Sarah Thompson watched everything unfold from across the aisle. She had seen Jake's subtle signals to Maria and Marcus's increasingly rigid posture. Years of teaching unruly teenagers had taught her the art of patience, but this situation was testing every ounce of her self-control. In her mind, Sarah replayed the girl's tiny nod. If you're in trouble, nod once. She had seen it. She wasn't imagining things. Sarah thought back to the safety seminars she had attended at school, presentations about how human trafficking could happen anywhere, shopping malls, gas stations, airports. Now, here she was in the middle of it. For a moment, she hesitated. Should I get up? Should I confront him? But she remembered the advice they always gave. Do not escalate the situation. Report quietly and discreetly. She could already tell Jake knew something. The flight crew was handling it. Trust them, Sarah. Don't blow this up. Still, her instincts wouldn't let her rest. She adjusted her seatbelt, leaned over as if to stretch, and glanced at Lily again. The girl's small frame seemed to shrink into her seat, but when their eyes briefly met, Sarah smiled softly, an attempt to reassure her. Lily blinked in response, her lips trembling. Lily's nightmare. Lily Chen's thoughts drifted back to how it all started, back to the night her world fell apart. She had been waiting for her mother to come home from work, sitting on the floor of their tiny apartment and finishing her math homework. She hadn't seen the man in the doorway until it was too late. He was a friend of the family, or so he claimed, and in a single moment, Lily's life had shattered. Marcus Delgado wasn't just a stranger. He was part of something larger, a network she couldn't even fully comprehend. He had taken her from her home, promising her safety, only to strip her of her freedom. Now she was a pawn, a commodity to be traded. As Lily sat in her cramped seat on flight 417, Marcus's threats echoed in her head. If you fight me, I'll make sure your family suffers. Her mother, her little brother. She had to protect them. But when the flight attendant had smiled at her earlier, something inside Lily had snapped. It was now or never. She'd made the signal, praying that someone would recognize it. And now she waited. Marcus's growing suspicion. Marcus Delgado wasn't stupid. He'd been in this business long enough to know when something was wrong. His instincts had kept him alive and out of prison for years. He glanced at the flight attendant. Jake, was it? As the man passed by again, his movements too calculated, too careful. Something about him didn't sit right. Marcus could feel a change in the air, like the whole plane was holding its breath. His jaw tightened. He leaned toward Lily and hissed, "Did you talk to him?" "No," Lily said quickly, her voice trembling. Marcus studied her face for a moment, searching for any hint of deceit. He didn't trust her, hadn't trusted her since the day he took her. Girls like her always thought they could outsmart men like him. If she had done something, Marcus needed to act fast. He couldn't afford to be caught. The pilot's message. In the cockpit, Captain Evelyn Rodriguez monitored the plane's systems while listening intently to the communications from air traffic control. A notification blinked on her console, confirmation that law enforcement was coordinating with airport security in Las Vegas. Evelyn's brow furrowed as she reread Jake's report. She knew how delicate situations like this could be. Confronting the suspect too early could backfire, especially at 35,000 feet. But if they waited too long, the girl's life could be in danger. "Keep me updated," Evelyn said over her headset, her voice calm but firm. "We'll be ready for landing procedures." The moment of truth. Jake felt Marcus's gaze follow him as he moved through the cabin again. The man's suspicions were growing, and Jake knew he didn't have much time left. He made his way back to Sarah, pausing briefly at her row. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly. Jake nodded. "It's under control. But if something happens, stay seated and don't intervene. Let us handle it." Sarah swallowed hard but gave a firm nod. As Jake continued down the aisle, he noticed something that sent a jolt of panic through his system. Marcus Delgado had unbuckled his seatbelt and was leaning toward Lily, whispering harshly in her ear. Jake's heart pounded as he quickened his pace back to the galley. "Maria," he said, his voice low but urgent, "we might have a problem. He's getting suspicious." Maria's eyes widened. "What do we do?" Jake hesitated for only a second before responding. "We're out of time. We need to move now. I'll alert the pilot to call for an immediate cabin lockdown." Maria nodded, her face set with determination. Jake picked up the cabin intercom and pressed the button to the cockpit. "Captain, it's Jake. We need to initiate lockdown protocol. Now." The final stretch. The tension in the cabin thickened as Jake turned back toward row 14, his hands clenched into fists. Marcus was still whispering to Lily, his expression dangerous, his posture rigid. Lily's eyes darted toward Jake as he approached, and for the first time in hours, Jake smiled softly. "Hold on just a little longer." The flight was descending toward its destination, but the real danger was only just beginning. The descent into danger. The steady hum of the engines reverberated through the cabin as Flight 417 began its slow descent toward Las Vegas. Passengers stirred in their seats, stretching and checking their watches, unaware that a life-or-death scenario was quietly unfolding around them. In row 14, Marcus Delgado's eyes narrowed beneath his sunglasses as the flight attendant, Jake, walked past yet again, his presence lingering just a little too long. Marcus's instincts flared. Something wasn't right. They know, he thought, or at least they suspect. Beside him, Ladi Chen kept her head low, but her heart pounded violently in her chest. Every second felt like an eternity. Her trembling fingers fidgeted with the hem of her jacket, trying to mask her nerves. She dared not look at Marcus, afraid that her fear would betray her. "Stop fidgeting," Marcus hissed under his breath, squeezing her wrist just hard enough to make her wince. "Yes, sir," Lily whispered, tears stinging her eyes. She had made the signal, had taken the chance, and now she could only hope that someone was coming to help her. But Marcus was growing suspicious, and Lily could feel the walls closing in. What if he figures it out? What if he hurts someone? A race against time. At the back of the plane, Jake's pulse raced as he held the intercom to his ear. The pilot's voice crackled through the line. "Understood, Jake. Cabin lockdown procedures are ready. Local law enforcement is waiting for us at the gate. We'll begin final descent shortly. Be careful." Jake exhaled sharply, bracing himself. They had a plan, but executing it without causing panic or tipping off Marcus was going to be a delicate operation. He turned to Maria. "Let's keep it quiet for as long as we can. We can't let him know we're onto him." Maria nodded, her expression resolute. "I'll loop back and keep an eye on him. You get ready." Jake quickly scanned the cabin. He spotted Sarah Thompson in 14D, watching the situation unfold with her sharp, observant eyes. He knew she'd been a crucial set of eyes on Marcus and Lily. Without breaking stride, he leaned close as he passed her seat. "We're moving soon," Jake whispered. "Stay calm and trust us." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Be careful," she murmured. Marcus on edge. Marcus Delgado's patience was wearing thin. He had been in this business too long to ignore the warning signs. The flight attendant's lingering glances, the woman across the aisle's too frequent stares, the hushed whispers among the crew. He leaned closer to Lily, his voice low and threatening. "What did you do?" "Nothing," Lily whimpered. "I didn't do anything, I promise." Marcus studied her face, searching for any flicker of a lie. The girl was good at looking helpless, too good. He could feel the noose tightening, and every instinct screamed at him to act. If the authorities were waiting for him in Las Vegas, he needed to stay one step ahead. "I can still fix this," he thought. "I always fix things." He unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements slow and deliberate. "We're going to the bathroom," he said flatly. Lily froze. "What?" Marcus grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "Get up. Now." Lily's eyes darted around the cabin, wild with panic. Marcus was pulling her toward the aisle, his posture stiff and controlled, his expression neutral enough not to attract attention, but Jake noticed immediately. From the front of the plane, Jake's eyes locked on Marcus as he guided Lily out of her seat. "He's moving. Something's wrong." The confrontation. Jake acted quickly, his voice calm but authoritative as he approached row 14. "Sir, is there a problem?" Marcus turned, masking his annoyance with a thin smile. "No problem. My niece just needs the restroom." Jake's eyes flickered to Lily, who was pale and trembling. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. "Let me assist her," Jake said smoothly, stepping closer. "We don't want her to get bumped in the aisle." Marcus's grip on Lily's arm tightened. "I can handle it." Jake's smile didn't waver, but his tone shifted just enough to carry weight. "Sir, it's our policy to assist minors. Why don't you return to your seat, and I'll take her to the restroom." For a moment, Marcus's mask slipped, and his eyes burned with suspicion and anger. The two men locked eyes, an unspoken battle of wills. Around them, passengers were starting to take notice, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "I said I've got it," Marcus growled, his voice low and dangerous. Jake didn't back down. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat now." The moment of courage. It was in that moment, when the tension became almost unbearable, that Lily acted. With a sudden burst of bravery, she twisted violently in Marcus's grip and screamed, "Help me." Her voice rang out through the cabin like a gunshot. Passengers gasped, heads snapping toward the scene. Marcus, caught off guard, stumbled as Lily pulled free from his grasp and backed into the aisle. Jake didn't hesitate. He stepped between Marcus and Lily, his stance protective. "Sir, sit down," he barked, his voice loud enough to carry through the plane. Marcus's face twisted in rage. "You don't understand. She's lying. This is my niece." "Sit down," Jake repeated, his voice commanding. Maria appeared at the other end of the aisle, cutting off Marcus's escape route. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice icy. Lily clung to the back of a seat, tears streaming down her face. "He's not my uncle," she cried. "Please help me." The entire cabin fell silent. Passengers stared wide-eyed, some pulling out their phones to record the chaos. Marcus's face turned a deep shade of red as he glanced between Jake and Maria, calculating his next move. He could see the writing on the wall. He was cornered. The descent into justice. "Sir, you're going to sit down and stay calm," Jake said, his voice steady but unyielding. "Law enforcement is waiting for you on the ground." Marcus looked like he might lunge, but Maria stepped forward, holding up a hand. "Don't even think about it." Defeated, Marcus let out a low growl and sank back into his seat, his hands clenching the armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. Jake turned to Lily, who was still shaking. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." Lily nodded, though tears continued to roll down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. Passengers began murmuring, their shock palpable as they pieced together what had just happened. Sarah Thompson leaned into the aisle, her eyes meeting Lily's. She gave a small nod and a gentle smile, a silent acknowledgement of Lily's courage. The final minutes. In the cockpit, Captain Evelyn Rodriguez received the final update from Jake. "The suspect is contained," Jake reported. "The girl is safe." "Good work," Evelyn replied, relief evident in her voice. "We'll have the authorities waiting for him on the ground. Buckle up. We're making our final approach." As the plane began its descent, Jake returned to the galley, where Maria gave him a shaky grin. That was intense. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Yeah, but she's safe. That's what matters." Maria glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Lily sat under Sarah's watchful eye. "You think she'll be okay?" Jake nodded. "She's strong. She'll be okay." The landing. As Flight 417 touched down on the tarmac in Las Vegas, the plane erupted into applause, some for the landing, others for the silent heroes who had just saved a life. At the gate, uniformed officers waited, their presence unmistakable. Marcus Delgado didn't fight as he was led off the plane in handcuffs, his face blank, his confidence shattered. Lily stood quietly at the front of the plane, her small hands clutching the straps of her backpack. Jake knelt beside her and smiled softly. "You were really brave, Lily. You saved yourself." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. As Lily walked off the plane surrounded by officers, Sarah Thompson met Jake's eyes one last time. "You did good," she said simply. Jake smiled. "We all did." But deep down, he knew it was Lily, despite her fear, who had shown the most courage of all. After the fall, the descent of Flight 417 had felt like an eternity to Jake Sullivan. The tension had been a steady pulse, thundering in his ears even as the plane's wheels touched down on the tarmac in Las Vegas. Relief washed over him, but it was fleeting. His job wasn't finished yet. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, passengers murmured among themselves, their voices a mix of confusion, concern, and awe. Many had witnessed the explosive confrontation in Row 14, though few understood the gravity of what had unfolded. Phones had recorded shaky videos, and the whispers spread like wildfire. A man taken down, a girl saved, but why? Lali Chen sat near the front of the plane now, flanked by two uniformed officers. Her small figure looked even more fragile in the oversized seat. The tears had stopped, but her face was pale, her expression hollow. She held her backpack tightly against her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Jake watched her from the galley, his heart aching. It was over, or at least, the immediate danger was. But Lily looked as though she was still trapped in that moment. Maria stood beside Jake, whispering under her breath. She looked so lost. Jake nodded. She's been through hell. She's brave, Maria added quietly. Most kids wouldn't have had the courage to signal for help. That's what makes us special, Jake replied, his voice heavy with admiration. The arrest. The doors of the plane opened to a waiting line of law enforcement officers, their navy uniforms stark against the bright airport lights flooding into the cabin. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression, stepped on board first. His name tag read Detective Harris. "Which one?" he asked briskly. Jake gestured toward Marcus Delgado, who sat quietly in his seat with his hands resting on his knees. His sunglasses were off now, revealing cold, calculating eyes that seemed unbothered by the chaos around him. Harris approached Marcus slowly. "Marcus Delgado." Marcus didn't answer. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, human trafficking, and unlawful imprisonment," Harris said, his voice calm but forceful. "You have the right to remain silent." Marcus's face twitched, a flicker of defiance passing over him, but he didn't resist. He stood when ordered and allowed the officers to cuff his hands behind his back. Passengers gasped, some leaning into the aisle to get a better view. "Move," Harris ordered, and Marcus was led off the plane. For the first time, Jake saw the flicker of something human in Marcus' expression: fear. Lily's courage. Jake turned his attention back to Lily. The officers surrounding her spoke softly, but Lily didn't seem to hear them. She stared blankly at the seat in front of her, her knuckles white as she clutched her backpack. Jake knelt down so he was at eye level with her. "Hey, Lily," he said gently. Her head turned slightly, her eyes glassy but focused on him. "You're safe now," Jake continued. "They're going to take care of you. And your family, they're going to be okay." Lily's lower lip trembled. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I promise," Jake said firmly. "The police are here, and they're going to make sure Marcus can't hurt you or anyone else ever again." For a moment, Lily said nothing. Then finally she nodded, as if trying to convince herself of the truth in Jake's words. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake felt his throat tighten. "You did this, Lily. You saved yourself. You're stronger than you know." Tears slid down her cheeks, but this time they were different. Not tears of fear or despair, tears of release. The scene at the gate. As Lily was gently guided off the plane by the officers, the cabin erupted in a mixture of relief and muted applause. Passengers craned their necks to see her leave, and some whispered words of encouragement as she passed. "Poor girl," someone murmured. "She's so brave," said another. Sarah Thompson, who had played her quiet role in the ordeal, stood up as Jake passed her. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked softly. Jake offered a small smile. "She's safe now, thanks to you too." Sarah shook her head. "No, she did it. We just noticed." "She needed someone to notice," Jake said firmly. "That's more than most people would do." Sarah nodded, blinking back tears. "I'm glad she's okay." The investigation begins. As the passengers disembarked, Jake and Maria stayed behind to assist the authorities. Detective Harris stood with his team, gathering statements and collecting evidence. Jake detailed everything he had seen: Lily's hand signal, Marcus's behavior, and the moment she cried out for help. "This hand signal," Harris said, scribbling notes in his pad. "It's the one from the trafficking seminars, right?" Jake nodded. She tucked her thumb into her palm and closed her fingers around it. "It's subtle, but unmistakable." "Good catch," Harris said, looking up. "You probably saved her life today." Jake shrugged. "She saved herself. I just did my job." "Most people wouldn't have noticed," Harris replied, his tone serious. "Or they would have looked the other way." Maria chimed in. "It's a good thing Jake doesn't know how to look the other way." Jake offered a small smile but didn't respond. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had done what anyone should have done. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the truth. Too many people missed the signs. Too many looked away. Lily's new beginning. In the terminal, Lily sat quietly in a corner with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. A kind female officer knelt beside her, handing her a cup of hot chocolate. "Your mom is on her way," the officer said gently. "We contacted her, and she's coming to pick you up." Lily nodded weakly, holding the cup in her hands for warmth. Her mind was still reeling, but the words brought her a small measure of comfort. She thought about Jake, the flight attendant with the kind eyes who had believed her silent cry for help. She thought about Sarah, the woman across the aisle who had whispered words of hope. Strangers who had seen her when she thought no one would. A spark of something warm and unfamiliar began to grow in her chest. Hope. Heroes in uniform. Back at the gate, Jake watched as law enforcement loaded Marcus Delgado into a waiting police car, his stoic mask finally cracked. The man who had controlled Lily's every move now looked small, defeated. Maria stood beside Jake, letting out a long breath. "It's over." "For now," Jake replied. "For her, it's just the beginning." Maria glanced at him, her expression soft. "You know, you don't have to carry this like it's your responsibility." Jake looked at her, his eyes thoughtful. "If we don't carry it, Maria, if people don't pay attention, then kids like Lily slip through the cracks. And I'm not okay with that." Maria smiled faintly. "You've got a big heart, Jake Sullivan." Jake turned back toward the window, watching the plane's reflection fade in the evening light. "I just try to do what's right." The power of awareness. In a quiet corner of the airport, Sarah Thompson pulled out her phone and typed a message to her colleagues back at school. "I just witnessed something incredible today. A young girl saved herself from a dangerous situation because she knew a simple hand signal for help. Please remind our students how important it is to stay aware. Teach them. Share it. You never know whose life you might save." She hit send, her heart heavy but hopeful. Lily's last thought. As Lily sat in the terminal waiting for her mother, she watched the officers speaking softly nearby. Despite everything, a strange calm washed over her. For the first time in months, she felt free. Her mother would come. She would go home. She would start over. And though the road ahead would be long, Lily promised herself something. She would never let anyone silence her again. She would tell her story. Because someone had noticed, someone had listened, and that had made all the difference. A new dawn. The Las Vegas evening sun bathed the airport terminal in hues of gold and crimson. Beyond the tall glass windows, the city sparkled like a sea of stars, as though unaware of the gravity of what had happened just hours earlier. Inside, the air felt heavy with stories unspoken, lives forever altered, and quiet victories celebrated in silence. Lily Chen sat on a padded bench in the far corner of the terminal, her knees pulled up toward her chest, the oversized airport-issued blanket still draped around her shoulders. She felt small, so incredibly small, but for the first time in what seemed like forever, she also felt safe. The female officer from earlier, Officer Ramirez, stayed close, her voice soft and kind whenever she spoke. "Your mom's almost here, Lily. Just a little longer." Lily nodded, staring down at the cooling cup of hot chocolate in her hands. She wanted to feel relief, she really did, but the fear still lingered in the back of her mind, like a shadow refusing to leave. What if Marcus came back? What if someone like him found her again? But then she thought of Jake, the flight attendant who had noticed her silent signal, of Sarah, the stranger who whispered just enough encouragement to push her forward, of the officers who now stood guard like silent protectors. Not everyone is bad, Lily reminded herself. Some people cared, and they had saved her. A mother's love. The sound of hurried footsteps broke through Lily's thoughts, and when she looked up, her breath caught in her throat. Lily. Her mother, Mei Chen, appeared at the far end of the terminal, sprinting toward her. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes wrinkled, as if she had thrown them on without a second thought. Tears streamed down her face as she dropped her bag to the floor and threw her arms around Lily. "Lily, my baby," she sobbed, pulling her daughter close, her hands trembling as they cupped Lily's face. "I'm here. You're safe now. You're safe." Lily broke down, tears spilling freely as she clung to her mother. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered through broken sobs. "I'm so sorry." Mai held her tighter, shaking her head. "You have nothing to apologize for. You're here. You're alive. That's all that matters." Officer Ramirez stepped back to give them privacy, her own eyes glassy. A nearby officer whispered into his radio, "The girl has been reunited with her mother. All clear." As Mai rocked her daughter gently, the weight of the nightmare finally began to lift. For months, she had lived with the unimaginable pain of not knowing where Lily was, of waking up every day with the fear that her daughter might never come home. Now, in this terminal filled with strangers, her family was whole again. The reckoning. A few days later, in a sterile interrogation room downtown, Marcus Delgado sat handcuffed to a metal table. The harsh light overhead reflected off his defeated face, the once cocky expression replaced by bitter silence. Across from him, Detective Harris flipped open a file folder and began listing charges in a calm, measured tone. Kidnapping, human trafficking, assault, unlawful restraint. Harris leaned back, his eyes cold. "You're looking at decades in prison, Marcus." Marcus didn't respond. He simply stared ahead, his face blank. Harris continued, his voice dropping an octave. "You're part of something bigger, aren't you? This isn't the first time, and we both know it." He slapped a grainy photo onto the table, another girl, younger than Lily, looking equally frightened. "How many others are out there? How many lives have you ruined?" A flicker of anger crossed Marcus's face, but he said nothing. "Here's what you need to understand," Harris added, leaning forward. "You messed up this time. That girl you took, she fought back. She signaled for help. And people noticed. People like her. They're going to bring your whole operation crushing down." Marcus's jaw clenched, but Harris could see it, the crumbling facade. The empire Marcus Delgado had built in the shadows was finally coming apart. The story shared. Back in Milwaukee, Sarah Thompson sat at her desk, the warm glow of her desk lamp illuminating her laptop screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she finalized the last few lines of an email. "Dear parents and students, I wanted to share something I recently witnessed during my flight to Las Vegas. A brave young girl, no older than some of you, used a simple hand signal to silently call for help. Because people noticed, she was saved from a very dangerous situation. Human trafficking happens far more often than we realize. It's something we don't talk about enough, but we need to. It's our job to watch, listen, and act when we see something that feels wrong. I've attached resources and a short guide on recognizing the universal signal for help. Please share it with your friends, your children, and your students. You never know whose life you might save. Stay safe and stay aware. With care, Sarah Thompson." She read the email one last time, hit send, and leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. She thought of Lily, the small, trembling girl who had shown more courage than anyone Sarah had ever met. "Good for you, kid," Sarah whispered to herself. Lily's voice. 3 weeks later, Lily sat beside her mother in a softly lit counselor's office. The therapist, a kind woman with warm eyes and a patient smile, handed Lily a notebook. "I want you to write about this, Lily," the therapist said gently. "Your story is powerful. Telling it will help you heal." Lily hesitated, staring at the blank pages. For so long, she had felt silenced, her voice buried under fear and threats. Could she really tell her story? Could she face it? Mai placed her hand on Lily's knee, squeezing gently. "You're stronger than you know," she said softly. Lily looked at her mother, at the woman who had never stopped searching for her. Then she looked back at the notebook and, for the first time, let herself believe it. She opened the cover and began to write. Jake's reflection. On board a new flight, Jake Sullivan walked down the aisle, smiling at passengers as he helped them settle into their seats. A little girl sitting by the window caught his eye as she waved enthusiastically at him. He waved back, his grin genuine. "Excuse me, sir," a voice said behind him. Jake turned to see an older woman with kind eyes smiling at him. "You're Jake Sullivan, aren't you?" she asked. "The flight attendant from the news." Jake paused, caught off guard. "I guess I am," he said with a chuckle. The woman's smile softened. "What you did for that girl, it was incredible. You gave her hope." Jake felt a lump rise in his throat. "She gave herself hope," he replied. "I just listened." The woman nodded, as if she understood more than he had said. "Well, the world needs more people like you." Jake smiled softly and moved down the aisle, the woman's words lingering in his mind. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He never had. But as he looked out over the cabin filled with strangers, he made himself a promise. He would always pay attention, he would always listen, because sometimes noticing someone's silent cry for help was enough to change everything. A world changed. Across the country, Lily's story spread. Schools began teaching the hand signal for help. Parents talked to their children about safety. Strangers learned to look closer, to question what felt off. And somewhere, in another town, on another flight, another girl sat in silence, afraid and uncertain, until she remembered the signal Lily had used. She curled her thumb into her palm and closed her fingers around it. And someone noticed.